All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to week number 6 and the final week of our teaching on putting the Bible under the microscope. Now let's do a really quick review of how we got to where we are right now. We began a few weeks ago with the question, who has the final authority in life? Who gets to say you can do this, you can't do that? And we said, well, God himself has the final authority. Well, how can we know God's mind? God's invisible. We can't directly speak to him or hear from him per se. So how can we know God's mind? How can he communicate with us? And we learned the answer is revelation. Revelation meaning an unveiling. God has to communicate himself to us. And we learned there are two major types of revelation. There's general revelation through creation or nature and through our conscience. And also there's a special revelation. That's the particular revelations like visions or dreams or prophecies. There's also the living word, which was Jesus who came in flesh. And then there's the written word, which is the Bible. And we said it's the written word, the Bible, that we're focusing on in this series. Bible simply is from the word biblos, which means books. So the Bible, as we learned in a series a while ago, that it's a compilation of several books together in one volume. That's what the Bible is. So then we looked into the inspiration of Scripture. That's the process by which God directed individuals to produce the written words. It's the inspiration that gives the Bible its authority. The words are God-breathed, literally God-breathed. And we learned it's the text, not the authors that were inspired. It's the actual words, not the authors themselves that were inspired. Now, God moved upon those authors, but strictly speaking, it's the words that are inspired, not the authors. And we learned three things about inspiration. We said it's plenary, meaning it's full, meaning every word in the Bible is inspired. It's verbal, meaning it's the words themselves that are inspired, not just the concepts, but the very words themselves. And we said, and it's confluent, meaning that it's the product of both divine and human agency. God used each human and their personalities and their backgrounds and their knowledge and their life experiences. He flowed along with them to produce each document in the Bible. After inspiration, we then looked at inerrancy. And we said, meaning inerrant is the quality of being free from all falsehood or mistake. And we said that doesn't mean that everything the Bible says is true, because you can read quotes in the Bible that are false. The devil is quoted in the Bible. So it's not saying everything the Bible says is true. It's everything that the Bible teaches or affirms is true. And that was a distinction that we made, and we went to great lengths on that week outlining what that meant. And what about apparent errors in the Bible? Well, we discussed ways to resolve or harmonize those difficulties. And when those couldn't be resolved or harmonized, we gave you three options that you could choose from. And then the last time we were together, we looked at the canon of Scripture. That's canon with one N, C-A-N-O-N. And that's from the Greek word kanon, which simply means the word for a rod or a ruler or a measuring stick. And that came to be used for meaning a standard. Okay, so how the canon means the accepted standard, the accepted books of the Bible. How did we get these particular books, these particular texts? And we learned all about canonization last week, how we got our Bible, how it wasn't so much a matter of we had a menu of all these books to choose from, and we said, we'll take that one and that one and that one. No. They had to come from the New Testament, we're speaking now, from the apostolic circle, meaning either written by an apostle or one closely affiliated and affiliated with or endorsed by an apostle. And so that was last week. We spoke at length when it came to canonization. So now we've got to the final thing, and we're going to talk about translations, the translation of Scripture. Okay? Now there are all kinds of, and we're talking English right now, all kinds of English translations. I just sat down very quickly and wrote down off the top of my head some translations I could think of. There's the King James Version. There's the New King James Version. There's the American Standard Version. There's the American Standard Bible. There's the New American Standard Bible. There's the Revised Standard Version, the New International Version, then the Newer International Version. Then there's the English Standard Version, the Good News Bible. There's the Message. There's the Living Bible. There's the New World Translation if you're a Jehovah's Witness. There's all kinds of English translations out there. And I've heard people say over the years, there's so many versions of the Bible. Well, that's true, but not in the way they mean it. When they say there's so many translations, what they think is all of these translations are saying something different. We're going to show today why that's not true. That's a misunderstanding of what a translation actually is. And so to help us understand this, on your outlines, I've given what I've called the family tree of every Bible translation. No matter the language, this is essentially the family tree of every Bible translation. So number one is the divine author. The divine author, which is, of course, God himself, okay? That's inspiration. They're God-breathed, okay? So there's the divine author. That's your first blank. And then the next step in the family tree is the human author. The human author. Remember, this is where we talked about confluence, meaning flowing together. God worked with the minds and the hearts, that's an arrow. God worked with the minds and the hearts of the humans, and together then they produced, number 3, the original text. The original text. Okay? Remember, we referred to those, and scholars referred to the original text as the autograph. Meaning when Paul wrote Galatians, the original text was the actual letter on the parchment that Paul's scribe used. That was the original, the first draft. Like, this is the original text of my notes, okay? This is the autograph of my notes. And that's, do we still have these? No, we don't, because they're 2,000 years old and they've decayed by now. But the original text in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. So, the divine author, then the human author, then the original text. And then, number 4, copies of the original text. Copies of the original text is what comes next in the chain. So, Paul wrote the letter to Galatians, the church in Galatia. It was sent and delivered there. Then the people in the church in Galatia, they would copy it down. They all wanted a copy of it. So scribes would copy it, professional scribes, and then just everyday people in that region of Galatia, they would copy it. And churches all around in the area would say, we want a copy of that too. And they would send someone to Galatia to copy from the original. Or one of the copies of the original, which had been sent to Ephesus, someone would go to Ephesus and say, do you have a copy of Paul's letter to the Galatians? Yeah, I do. Can we copy it? Sure, here it is. And so copies of copies and copies of copies of copies of copies would be made, okay? And there's thousands of copies, what are now referred to as manuscripts all over the world that they're finding them, okay? Then, so we don't have the originals, but we do have copies of the original to this day. And then next number is the critical text. The critical text. Okay, which is scholarship's consensus of the original text. So the critical text is scholarship's consensus of what the original text was. Meaning, what they did was, we don't have the originals any longer. It's 2,000 years ago. No ancient documents do we have the originals of. So this isn't just a Bible issue. And but there's all sorts of copies were made and spread around throughout the world. And what scholars have done is they've taken all of these manuscripts, thousands of them, and they put them side by side and they compare. And they can tell by all of these manuscripts, it's a science of textual criticism. Criticism not meaning critiquing so much as meaning informed sound judgment. And the science of textual criticism, and this isn't just applied to the Bible, it's applied to all ancient documents, the more copies you have, the better. They can now look at all the copies we have, compare, and they can discern what the original text actually said. It's literally down to a science now. By comparing and all of the different variances, and there are all sorts of variances on the manuscripts, that's true, because they've been copied thousands of times. That's not a bad thing. But they can tell, remember the 1 week, if you were here when we had, what was the statement I gave you? The dog is brown or something like that? And we showed you how each line had a mistake in it, but because you had all 10 of them, you could tell what the original statement was by comparing them. That's the science of textual criticism. And so with the history of every translation, we then have the critical text. So now today, scholars have what they refer to as the critical text. And they have, literally, they'll say a 99% certainty of what the original text said. So when you're reading your Bibles, you can know that the original, that's based upon a 99% certainty of what the original document actually said. Then the next step, number 6, is the translator. The translator. Meaning, so this is in Greek, okay? Now, we're trying to have an English Bible. So we need someone to translate from the critical text into English language. So you need someone, or this is often a translation committee. Rarely is it just one person. In fact, I wouldn't read a Bible that was just translated by one person. But a committee of scholars who make this decision. And then number 7 would be the final translation. So the translator goes to work, and they put together the final translation in whatever language you're talking about. So the translator takes the original, the critical text, and they try to put it in the English language, and they produce the final translation. And then number 8, the bottom of the chain, is the reader. That would be you. Because you are then taking what has been translated, the reader, that's you, okay? So you're on the family tree here. So it starts with the divine author, the human author, confluence, then the original text, inspired, then copies of the original text, then the scholars gather together all the copies that we have, compare, and they can have the critical text, meaning what we believe to be the original text. By piecing it all back together, translators then take the critical text and they try to translate it into whatever language the translation is in, and then you get the final translation, and then the reader interacts with that final translation. Okay? That's the family tree of every translation you've ever read. Now, before we get to point B on your outline, how to choose a translation, let's take a moment to see how this chain came about when it comes to how we got our English Bibles. Okay? The first English language Bibles were essentially based on an earlier Latin version of the Bible. A guy named Jerome translated the Bible from Greek into Latin around 400 AD. So a guy named Jerome, so here the translator Jerome took the critical text of Greek and he translated it into Latin. Okay? So Jerome, back in 400, took the Greek critical, whatever text they had back then, took that and he translated it into the final translation into Latin. And then that became what is called the Latin Vulgate. Vulgate, where we get our word vulgar, it was the word for common Latin. So he translated the ancient Greek into common Latin in 400. And for 1,000 years, churches in the British Isles used the Latin Vulgate. They read the Bible in Latin. Okay? Then, in 1380, a man named John Wycliffe translated the Bible from Latin into English. So he didn't go back to the critical text, to the Greek. It had been translated into Latin, so he took the Latin translation and then he retranslated it into English. So it went from Greek to Latin to English. That's what Wycliffe did. You think they probably patted him on the back for that, right? No. He was considered a heretic and was persecuted for doing this, for daring to translate the Bible into the common language of the day. That was considered unholy and somehow blasphemous. So people at that time were threatened with severe penalties for reading Wycliffe's forbidden Bible. Now, with the advancement of biblical scholarship, as well as the invention of the printing press, things began to move quickly when it came to Bible translations. In the year 1526, William Tyndale produced an English translation of the New Testament. But this was different. Tyndale went back to the critical text of the Greek. So Wycliffe's was translated from Latin to English, from Greek, Latin to English. What Wycliffe did was he went back to the original Greek. So this was Greek to English, okay? A few years later, in 1530, Tyndale produced an English translation of the Old Testament. So he went back to the Hebrew as well to make from Hebrew to English. Now, some estimate that 83% of the New Testament portion of the early King James Version is directly quoted from Tyndale's translation. And 76% of the Old Testament portion of the original King James Version is attributed to Tyndale. Tyndale was congratulated for doing this. No, he was executed by strangulation. And then his body was burned at the stake for doing this. Shortly after Tyndale's death, Miles Coverdale produced a translation of the entire Bible into English in 1535. Many other English versions followed over the next several decades. None of them, though, satisfied the different factions within the English church. So in 1604, King James I authorized a new translation of the entire Bible for use in churches in England. And the leading university scholars in England produced the authorized version of 1611, which is commonly known today as the King James Version. Okay, the KJV. 1601, 1604, King James said, we need a version that all the English people agree on that can be used in English churches. So he pulled together a committee, and in 1611 they produced the authorized version of 1611, which now is known as the King James Version. The goal was to translate the original Greek and Hebrew text, the critical texts, into the language of ordinary people with enough dignity to be used in the church. So they didn't want it to be vulgar, street language, but they wanted it to be common enough, but still dignified enough to be spoken in the church. The first translators of the King James Version anticipated that this new version of the Bible would bring opposition from those who refused to break with tradition. Listen to what they wrote in the preface of the first King James Version. Now the irony should not escape you here. So this was the preface of the original King James Bible. For was anything ever undertaken with a touch of newness or improvement about it that did not run into storms of argument or opposition? The king was well aware that whoever attempts anything for the public, especially if it has to do with religion or with making the word of God accessible and understandable, sets himself up to be frowned upon by every evil eye and casts himself headlong on a row of spikes to be stabbed by every sharp tongue. For meddling in any way with a people's religion is meddling with their customs and their inalienable rights. And although they may be dissatisfied with what they have, they cannot bear to have it altered. So the church should always be ready with translations in order to avoid the inability to understand because of a language barrier. Translation is what opens the window to let the light in. I find that ironic because there are people today who are called King James only people who say that the only Bible translation you should read is King James. That's the Bible Paul read, in their minds. And hopefully you can see the irony of that. But, and so they're saying, no, you should not have any new translations in modern language. That's a terrible thing. But the very first writers of the King James Version, they said, this is written so people can understand the Bible in a language that they can understand. And it should let the light in. We should be open to that. So why do we have so many English translations? This isn't on your outline, but you might want to jot it down somewhere. It's first of all because language changes and evolves over time. Language changes and evolves over time. So that's why we need different English translations. And secondly, because any given moment in time, there's more than one way to say the same thing. At any given moment in time, there's more than one way to say the same thing. So we have the critical text, which is what we think was the original text. And so that's in Greek, but there's more than one way to translate a Greek phrase. Let me give an example. Years ago, I was watching a speech of John Kerry. Remember, he ran for president years ago in the States? And he's fluently bilingual. He speaks very fluent French. And one day I was watching TV, and John Kerry was giving a speech in French. And it was being translated into English on more than one TV station. Now, I studied French for 7 years, but I'm not bilingual by any means. But I can pick up some stuff. But so I'm listening to this, and I'm listening to it being translated into English, and I flicked to another station where it was also being translated by a different translator, and there was a delay between the two. So one was earlier than the other. So I thought, no, this will be fascinating, because my mind is that stupid. But I thought, I want to hear what this translator's saying versus what this translator's saying. They're both translating the same guy. And so I went back and forth from station to station, and they were essentially translating the same thoughts, but they did not use the identical words. But that's what a translator does. They do their best to take the critical text, what's being said by the person, and they translate it into another language. And there are different ways of saying the same thing. So, John Kerry said, bonjour. Now, one translator could say, hello, and another could say, good day, and another could say, hi. Who's wrong? They're all right. Okay? Bonjour means good day, it means hello, it means hi. You can translate it in different ways, and there's a sort of a continuum of formality when it comes to the translation. So why do we have so many English translations? Because language changes and evolves over time, particularly centuries. Because at any given moment, there's more than one way to say the same thing. And thirdly, because readers vary in their desires and needs when it comes to reading the Bible. We vary in our desires and needs when it comes to reading the Bible. There are times when I'm sitting down and I just want to read the Bible devotionally for my own personal devotion versus when I'm studying to teach a class and I have a different need of the Bible at that time. And there are different translations that suit those different moments in our lives, which we'll explain a bit more in a moment. So, which brings us to letter B. How to choose a translation. Number one, here's what I would say. Choose a translation that is based upon the best manuscripts. Choose a translation that is based upon the best manuscripts. Okay? So let's go back to our family tree here. The critical text. Okay? The critical text, this is produced by taking all the manuscripts we have in the world and comparing them. Okay? Takes the best manuscripts. Now, the critical text is only as good as the manuscripts it's based upon. The more manuscripts, the better. The earlier, the closer to the original, the better, right? Okay, so keep that in mind. So try to find a translation that uses the best manuscripts, the earliest and the most manuscripts for the critical text. So when it comes to the accuracy of Bible translations, accuracy means closest to the original text. Now, here's what's counterintuitive. The older translation, meaning the King James Version that was translated in 1611, is not necessarily, in fact, it's not the better translation when it comes to the critical text. The oldest English translation is not based upon the oldest manuscripts. The manuscripts they had available in 1600s, we have far more, thousands more available now than they did back then. They did a great job with what they had back then, but we have many, many more since then, okay? Because the King James scholars were limited to the critical text that they had access to in the 1600s, and most of the critical text that existed back then came from the 12th century. Okay? So the copies that they had back then were from the 12th century. That was the earliest copies that they had back then. Since then, due to discoveries over the last 400 years, the critical text that more modern translations are based on includes manuscripts from as early as the 2nd century. Okay? And generally speaking, the closer to the original text, the better. Why? Because there's less chance of errors being brought into the copies. It's closer to the original, so there's fewer scribes have been in between you and the originals, so the chance of mistakes would be less. For example, the King James, and I'm not trashing the King James Version here. It's a wonderful version. I'm not trashing it at all. I'm just trying to give you a perspective here. King James is based upon 6 Greek manuscripts between the 10th and 13th centuries, but mostly from the 12th century. King James was revised in 1881 based on 2,000 manuscripts. the earliest being the 4th century. So the New King James was based on 2,000 manuscripts, and the earliest was the 4th century. So you can see how things had progressed by the 1800s. Modern translations are based upon 5,000 manuscripts, the earliest from the 2nd century. So we have 3,000 more manuscripts and back to as early as the 2nd century. So the earlier the better, and the more the better when it comes to the science of textual criticism. So, for example, you'll notice whatever version of the Bible you have, so if it's a modern translation, you'll notice at the bottom it will say, the earliest and most reliable manuscripts say. That's what they're trying to tell you when they say that. They're saying, okay, this verse here, and you look at the bottom and it'll say, some manuscripts say this, some manuscripts say that. What they're telling you is that, in all the thousands of manuscripts, there's enough that say something a little bit different. And they're letting you know there's some uncertainty about this passage. Now, that uncertainty does not change any doctrines or anything, but they're letting you know. So if anyone ever says, well, there's so many different variations of the Bible and the manuscripts and all that, and you don't know what you're reading, that's a lie. In fact, modern versions are just very transparent. Here's what some of the ancient manuscripts say. And you can check and see, oh yeah, that doesn't really change anything. Now, let me give you a couple examples. Mark chapter 16. Let's go to Mark 16. It's a famous passage, verses 9 to 20. This is the famous passage. It's the end of the Gospel of Mark. When Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene and drove out 7 demons. She went and told those who... Afterward, Jesus appeared in a different form to 2 of them while they're walking in the country. Jesus appeared to the 11. He said to them, go into all the world and preach the gospel of all creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved. And this is where we talk about speaking in tongues and taking up deadly poisons and it won't hurt them and so on. Modern translations will have that in italics, like this one I have here, the NIV. That's in italics, and they say, the earliest manuscripts and some other ancient witnesses do not have verses 9 to 20. So, in other words, that passage of portion has been added sometime between the original and in the copy stage. It wasn't in the earliest, most reliable manuscripts we have. So people say, the NIV takes some of the Bible out. Well, someone could say, no, other versions added to the Bible. It depends on which side of the argument you're on. But what they're saying is, now nothing in here essentially is not taught somewhere else in the Bible. But what they're saying is that just so you know, the chances are that wasn't in Mark's original gospel. The evidence we have right now is that wasn't in the original. It's been added sometime afterwards. Another example would be John chapter 7. And again, your versions will be honest, transparent with you about this. John chapter 7, 53 to 8:11. This is the woman caught in adultery. That's not in the earliest manuscripts. The woman caught in adultery, it's not there. The earliest, most reliable manuscripts, this has been added since. Just something to think about. Now, scholars don't deny that this likely happened. There's all sorts of stories of Jesus healing that some gospel writers used and others didn't. So there's no doubt that it took place, but it just wasn't in the original, it wasn't in the earliest copies of John that we have, okay? So, how to choose a translation? Choose a translation that is based upon the best manuscripts. Number 2, choose a translation that employs modern vocabulary. What I would recommend. Why? Every Christmas we sing Deck the Halls. And every year then we sing Deck the Halls, this is on full display. Because every time we get to that verse that says, don we now our gay apparel, all the young people giggle. Now, in the 1800s, when that version was written, the phrase simply meant, we now put on our festive, colorful clothing. That's what it meant in the 1800s when it was written. Today, it means let's put on our gay clothing, right? The word day has a very different meaning in our culture today. It's something completely different. The identical words over time refer to completely different things. And that's the whole point of having different translations. The whole point in creating a translation is to move the message from the original language, from the original language into a specific language that people can understand. So what translators are trying to do is take what Paul originally wrote and translate those thoughts and that meaning into English in the 21st century. That's not easily done. And you can see, because there's different ways of saying the same thing in the original language. Bonjour, hello, hi. Translators, the translators are important. They're an important link in all this. Who they are, what are their biases, and so on. So here's a bottom line. If your translation needs to be translated, you need to get a different translation. Okay? So how to choose a translation? First, choose a translation that's based on the best manuscripts. 2, choose a translation that employs modern vocabulary. 3, choose a translation according to your purpose. According to your purpose. So, like I said, bonjour, good day, hello, hi. Those are 3 options that lie on a spectrum or a continuum from formal to dynamic, as your outline says. So when it comes to translations, they're on this spectrum. On one end, on the left there, is formal, A. So 3A is formal. Formal equivalency are translations, attempts at a word-for-word translation. So a formal equivalency translations are attempts at a word-for-word translation, regardless of the intended meaning of the original author. So meaning, good day, if bonjour is, you're trying to translate from French to English. Bonjour, well, a formal equivalency would be bon, good, jour, day. So the formal translation would be good day. Okay? Now, although this sounds ideal, due to the cultural context of the original text, these translations, these formal ones, can sometimes be difficult to understand, and I'll demonstrate that in a moment. On the other end of the spectrum of the continuum is, as your outline says, dynamic equivalency. Dynamic equivalency. That's 3B. These are looser translations. Looser, not loser, but looser, 2 O's. These are looser translations seeking to communicate the original intent of the original author. So, example, a formal translation, formal dynamic from bonjour would be good day. An extreme dynamic would be hi. That's more a looser translation of bonjour. Hi. Okay? Now, these translations, the dynamic ones, strive to represent how the original author would have communicated the identical thought in our culture using our idioms. Now, if your purpose is an in-depth study, you're going to want to have access to one of the more formal translations. If your purpose is to read devotionally or to children or to an audience of unchurched individuals, you'd be well served in choosing maybe one of the more dynamic translations. Here's a classic example of this tension. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 12. 2 Corinthians 6:12. A literal translation, a word-for-word translation of 2 Corinthians 6:12 from the critical text is, we are not cramped, but you are cramped in your bowels. That's a literal translation, 2 Corinthians 6:12. Word for word, we are not cramped, you are cramped in your bowels. What? Okay, the original Greek word translated cramped meant, so the original Greek word was restraining or holding back. The original Greek word translated bowels is the word for our bowels or our intestines. In the first century, bowels or intestines were considered the center of affection. Because when you're excited or something, you feel it in your belly, right? Oh, my stomach's turning. Oh, this is exciting. Okay? But that's silly to us because we know in the modern world that the center of affection is the heart. Right? It's silly to us. Bowels, no, it's in the heart. Well, it's in neither, but that's just cultural, right? So a more formal translation, a more literal word-for-word translation simply repeats the words that the original author wrote. A more dynamic translation understands what the original author was communicating at that time And they seek to translate it into our language, in our idioms, in our time. It's more dynamic. So the difference in the two translations is key. Here's how the King James, a more formal translation, translates 2 Corinthians 6:12. You are not straitened in us, but ye are straitened in your own bowels. So you can see what they tried to do. Cramped turned into straightened, because that's what that sort of meant then. So you're not straightened in us, but you are straightened in your own bowels. A slightly less, so you're reading King James, you're going, what's Paul talking about bowels for? But they're trying to be formal. They're trying to be true to the original word for word. A slightly less formal, a more dynamic translation, the NIV, which is what I tend to use, translates it this way. We are not withholding our affection from you, but you're withholding yours from us. See, that's a more dynamic, but understanding what Paul was originally trying to say. You see the difference? So you're seeing the challenge of a translator. It's just not as simple as taking the modern equivalents of an ancient word and plugging it in. Words change depending upon the time and the culture. So, where various English translations might fit in, I've labeled it on your outlines, right? I've given you them. Yeah. So you can see, on one end, more formal, more word for word would be like the King James Version, American Standard, the Revised Standard. In the middle is sort of the New International Version and the English Standard Version. They're a blend of word for word with a little more dynamic. That's why I choose them, because you can use them for studying, but they're also a little more dynamic. They're trying to give you the meaning better than just a word for word. That's more confusing. Then farther to the right, the dynamic would be then the New Living Translation, then the Good News Bible, and then far on the other end of dynamic is the Message, which isn't strictly a Bible, it's a paraphrase. Eugene, thank you. He's Jeannie to me, but Eugene Peterson, that's his material. Like he wrote it. He's the author of the Message. And so that's strictly not a Bible, but it's a paraphrase. It's a very dynamic paraphrase. And sometimes when I'm reading what Peterson wrote, I'm thinking, what? It's really off from the original to a point where it's sometimes too far. And other times I'm reading it and I'm saying, that Bible doesn't say that. And I go back to the, a more formal one and I realize, no, he's done a good job here of putting it in different words. So let's see how these various translations deal with the identical phrase in the Bible. And with this, we're going to conclude. Here's the literal word-for-word translation of the Greek text of Luke 9:44. Luke 9:44 says, "Let sink you into the ears of you the words of these." That's the original. "Let sink you into the ears of you the words of these." See, Greek, by the way, you can just arrange the words in any order. That's why studying Greek it's not easy. Then, moving from the left to the right on our graph, from formal to dynamic, let's see how the different translations of this identical phrase, how they vary. King James, "Let these sayings sink down into your ears." The New King James, "Let these words sink down into your ears." The New American Standard Bible, the Revised Standard Version, "Let these words sink into your ears." New International Version, "Listen carefully." The New Living Translation, "Listen to me and remember what I say." The Good News Bible, "Don't forget what I'm about to tell you." The Message paraphrase, "Treasure and ponder each of these next words." So you can see, there's different ways of saying bonjour. Okay? Now, I was asked a while ago suggestions for Bible study, and just let me quickly give you this. No, these are just some suggestions. So, on your outline, various translations reflecting the various spectrum. So I'd recommend if you say, I want to seriously study the Bible, so you should use more than one translation. And I would recommend you pick ones from the continuum, one from the far left side and paraphrases as well. So when you're studying passages, you can get a wider sense. And then a Bible dictionary. Here's an example. There's lots of good ones out there. This is Nelson's Bible Dictionary, illustrated. And this takes essentially every word in the Bible in place, and it's like a dictionary. You look it up, and it gives you information about that. So these are very handy. I strongly recommend a Bible dictionary if you want to study the Bible. Then there's the Hebrew-Greek lexicon. This is what words, now this one's, for example, is vines, but it's the original Greek words and their precise meaning for English. I think this is tied to the King James Version, if I'm not mistaken. But and then you can find the English words, and then it'll give you the Greek counterpart, what they mean in Greek. Now, these are all hardcover books and so on, but I'm going to show you an easier way and cheaper. And then there's a Bible commentary. So let's say you're studying the book of Ephesians. There are hundreds of commentaries. Here's an example. The letter to the Ephesians, okay? And every verse in Ephesians, in the background and the history of everything, this is some scholars have put together this book. And if you want to study Ephesians verse by verse, take a commentary or a couple of them, because the commentary is only as good as the author. And have these on the side. So you read the passage and what are the scholars saying about this verse or this passage? And you can compare. So this is the scholars, and here's one example for the Gospel of Mark, okay? R.T. France, a famous scholar on Mark, okay? So for every book in the Bible, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of commentaries. And if you're not sure which ones to use, email us and we'll make some recommendations about some good ones to use, okay? Now, two good places to start online, BibleBrowser.com. That is free with very limited options, okay? But BibleBrowser.com, you can go there and you can look at, there's interlinear stuff, so you can click on a word and it'll show you the original Greek and Hebrew and so on. It's easy to use. Logos.com, that's a world-class resource with numerous study and budgeting options. There's a free option, but it's really kind of useless, I think. But you can pay different amounts, and you can have access to 20 times more books than I have in my library, and you can have them all on your phone. Okay? And so it's not cheap, but it's not overly expensive either. And there's different, depending on your budget, they give you different options you can choose from. So if you're willing to pay some money, logos.com, go there, check it out. If you just want to do the free thing, check out BibleBrowser.com and just go around on the website.